A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Robert Bryce, who has a long and illustrious resume here, but I'll just go through a little bit of it and then get him to do what he does to his guests, the famous self-introduction, which we've ripped off here at Decouple. So Robert is, of course, the host of the Power Hungry podcast. I think we have a lot of overlap in terms of our listenership. Author of 6 books, most recently Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations, a documentary filmmaker. I guess I'm not sure if you're the producer, director, or just the star of Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. And lastly, Robert, you're a generous mentor to myself and many other, I think, young and up-and-coming people getting interested in questions around energy. So a warm welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Always happy to be with you, Chris.
Excellent. So, I've gotten a lot of your kudos out of the way, your bona fides. Give us a little more about yourself, Robert, for those listeners that missed your earlier episode. I think it's probably about 80 episodes
Sure, happy
ago.
to do so. Well, first, glad to be back on Decouple with you. I've been pleased to see how successful you've been and the push you're making in Canada. My name is Robert Bryce. I live in Austin, Texas. First things first, happily married with the same woman. Lauren and I've been married now 36 years this year. We have 3 great kids, Mary, Michael, and Jacob, and they're all thriving and healthy and out of the house, which is a wonderful thing. The empty nest is a beautiful thing. Let me just say that as a proud father. I've written 6 books. I'm a writer, I'm a producer, I'm a podcaster, and I count myself lucky to be able to read, write, and speak about the energy and power systems, energy and power networks, because these are the world's biggest and most important industries, and every other industry in the world depends on them. And deeply concerned about the direction that both we're going here in the U.S. and Canada and around the world, where we have a lot of bad policy. And so there's plenty to write and talk about.
Robert, I've heard you introduce yourself a few times, and I like that you always start with the most important things first. Family man and father. So I brought you on today to talk about, big buzz going on in the U.S. I've been very busy up here in Canada and not paying as much attention as I'd like to the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And I know you've been writing about it, thinking about it deeply. And so, excited to bring you on to get a better sense of it.
Sure.
It's being hyped as, one of the greatest pieces of climate legislation to date. And there's a kind of bizarre consensus. I guess, you've written about this, but ExxonMobil and NRDC both endorsing this. Why don't you give us a broad strokes overview of the bill and what's going on?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing, Chris, is just how the parliamentary process here in the United States, how it's being perverted in the rush to pass this legislation. Right, there's a 50-50 deadlock between the Republicans and the Democrats in the Senate, and so they're using a parliamentary measure called reconciliation to force this measure through. And then Kamala Harris is casting the deciding vote as the vice president and president of the Senate. So, yes, the hype around it is remarkable in that it's these claims that this is the most far-reaching climate bill ever in the United States, and that this. I just finished writing a piece that Paul Krugman in the New York Times was what did he call it? I think the headline was, "Did Democrats just save civilization?" I mean, right. So the hype is just it's truly been extraordinary, but it's. Yeah, here it is. Did the Democrats just save civilization? Expert on energy and environment are giddy over what has been accomplished. And the world is a more hopeful place than it was just a few weeks ago, and on and on. This is part and parcel of this kind of the spin that's being put around this bill. But the thing that to me, well, the big picture to me, that's one of the key takeaways is that the U.S. is pushing a lot of these measures inside this $370 billion energy package, which is also contains prescription drugs and some Medicare reforms and some other things. $700 billion or so in spending, but it's being rushed through in this reconciliation process, and none of the key elements in the bill are being debated. I mean, and this is the punchline too, in terms of the kind of where is the money going? $370 billion energy and climate related spending. By my calculations, and I've been looking at the Congressional Budget Office report. I told you before we started, I was looking at it last night. There's 69 different provisions in this bill, 69 different line items, hydrogen, CCS, climate justice, EVs, but $127 billion is going to be given to the wind and solar sectors, which to me is just insane because of what we see happening in Europe and in Australia and in Britain, in California. This excessive subsidization of wind and solar are distorting electricity markets, and they're hurting consumers. And this is just more of the same. And yet it's being played as this great breakthrough. To me, it's just another example, unfortunately, of the swamp and how the NGO, industrial, corporate, congressional media complex is pushing through what I think is just bad policy.
I mean, is there any merit to going through some of the background on this? I mean, there was the Build Back Better bill. There's this figure, Senator Manchin, which Americans in the audience will be well aware of, but our international listeners may not. Is that a story worth exploring at all, or?
Well, sure. So Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia is a Democrat, and he has been the key vote in a lot of the negotiations. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, he broke off negotiations with the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and said, "No, this isn't going to work for me." And so he was pilloried in the press and called that this is you've single-handedly doomed humanity and all this other hyperbole. Well, then a couple weeks pass and Manchin changes his mind. And so suddenly the bill is back in play and everything moves forward and it gets passed through the Senate. But Manchin is interesting for a lot of reasons in that, he's from West Virginia, which is a conservative state, and it's a key swing state, and it's been a Republican state. And Trump did well there because he came out in favor of coal. West Virginia is a low-income state, heavily hydrocarbon-dependent coal and natural gas in particular. And so Manchin is trying to thread the needle here, I think. But I think in addition that he was under extraordinary pressure from the Democrats to get in line, and he did. And so they are able to push the bill. It hasn't become law yet, and it hasn't passed the House or signed into law by the president. But right now it looks like it's going to become law. And as I said, it's just more massive subsidies. If you I mentioned the $127 billion figure. If you add that on top of the existing subsidies for wind and solar, the total federal handouts for wind and solar could more than double and will total nearly $240 billion by 2031. In a decade, they're going to get $250 billion.
Wow. So, you've talked about this hyperpolarization, which I think is nothing new, this 50-50 split in the Senate. But we are seeing, again, these bizarre consensuses between folks like ExxonMobil and the NRDC. It sounds like there's a little something for everybody, as you were mentioning, the hydrogen folks, the carbon capture folks, obviously the wind and solar folks. I have seen groups like the Good Energy Collective, X Energy, TerraPower also endorsing this bill. What's in there for nuclear?
Well, there's $30 billion in zero emission, the production credit for nuclear. So that, if I were going to say there's something good in this bill, that would be the one line item that I think is good. But, I'm like you, Chris. I've become kind of pretty much a nuclear absolutist, that if we're serious about any of this, we have to go all in on nuclear, just full stop. And wasting and giving these, essentially just more pork barrel spending to solar and wind, when they're already getting over $100 billion between now and 2031, and giving them yet more. And by some analyses, these tax credits for solar and wind could be permanent in that they'll stay in place until U.S. emissions from the electric sector are 75% below 2005 levels. I mean, it's an extraordinarily high hurdle. So there are a few provisions that I think are good, but I think overall this is it's just more pork barrel spending, and it's being, cloaked in this climate saving kind of rhetoric that it's none of that is true. I mean, the other backdrop and the point that I was going to make earlier is it's just so remarkable to me to see this kind of hype and hyperbole around this bill when Europe is rushing back to coal as quickly as they possibly can. And so are the Chinese, and so are the Indians, and coal demand is going to set another record this year. It's going to set another record next year. I mean, it's just a truly, I don't know what the right word is, the disconnect between the reality and the rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, the failure to learn lessons, I think, is pretty astounding here.
Or
how
even just
much of
paying
this
attention, or
is
just paying attention to current affairs. I mean,
right,
what is happening? What's happening today? Let's look around and say, just take stock of where
right.
the world is today, and then say, well, how should we be reacting to this? And instead of, making what I think would be much more rational decisions around the future of decarbonization, which you and I well know cannot happen without large scale nuclear. It's just more of the same. The entrenched lobbies are getting yet more favors, and that to me is deeply depressing. Deeply discouraging. I won't say depressing.
Getting back to the stated purpose of the bill, the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously a few drivers of inflation. We've had record COVID spending. As a bit of an energy determinist or absolutist myself, the rising price of energy, as it's being referred to by a number of people, the secret ingredient in everything is certainly driving up prices quite a bit. What do you see as the major drivers of inflation? This bill's promise here is inflation reduction. Maybe a bit of a leading question, but
let me address just one other quick point here, Chris, because I want to talk about the inflation part because I think it's important. But the other part of the spin on this bill has been, and the Democrats' press release said, well, this will allow the U.S. to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2030. The 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Well, it's just not going to happen. And yet this was dutifully reported by the New York Times that this puts us on to the U.S. on track. Well, it would require cutting 1.2 billion tons of CO2 out of the U.S. emission stack and do it in 7.5 years. That's nearly equal to all of the emissions. It's equal to more than half of the emissions attributable to oil consumption in the United States. I mean, it's almost equal to all industrial emissions in the United States. I mean, this is just a massive reduction. And yet the spin around this has been, everyone just, use your damn calculator. I mean, this is clearly not going to happen. And yet this is just kind of the accepted wisdom and repeated without any context or any skepticism by the New York Times. I just find it unconscionable the way the media has been reporting this. Okay, so I had to get that out of the way. But the inflation issue, I mean, this is a global issue. And you and I, I track coal prices. I'm on tradingeconomics.com, right? Coal today in the Newcastle marker is at $370 a ton. Well, at the beginning of 2020, it was $50. So everybody's focused on oil prices. Yes, they've gone up, so they were around 30 and now Brent is trading at 90 or 100. So that's a tripling. Gas was at, $2 at Henry Hub and now it's at $8. So that's a quadrupling. Well, the coal prices have quintupled. I mean, so, where's the coverage of that? And so the energy costs reverberate throughout the entire economy. But then you add the other supply chain issues, and particularly around food. And this is going to be a very big issue. And you and I both interviewed Doomberg. I mean, that's very worrisome and that is directly related to the energy inputs. So we're seeing inflation across the board due to excessive government spending, due to supply chain issues, due to shortages of energy, or insufficient supplies of energy during times of high demand. So all of these things are working together, and they're going to have a big and negative impact on low and middle income consumers and low and middle income countries.
I'm no economist, but I've also heard that trade imbalances, fueling inflation as well. And, the dominant subsidies are going to the wind and solar industry, which, whose supply chains and production is predominantly overseas. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, to sort of try and steelman this, do you have an objection to subsidizing certain sectors of the power generation sector? If these subsidies were going more towards nuclear, is that something that you would end up supporting?
Hell yes.
Especially if that supply chain was local. So it's not an opposition to government intervention in this manner. Maybe
No, and I think as you and I have talked about, and we've had many guests, and Mark Nelson in common, and others, that what the electricity sector is not like the other parts of the energy business. This is a critically important network that cannot be allowed to fail. So we need robust government involvement and oversight to assure that the system works and that it's low cost, because it's the basis of everything. So as you know, nuclear energy does not thrive when just simply left to the market. It needs strong governmental support, both in the regulatory part of it, in the handling the waste and the fuels and the supply chains. So, but therein lies the conundrum, right? Well, you have to have strong governments to have strong nuclear entities, right? And so that's one of our big challenges. And I say our, invoking the papal we here, but I'm not. There is a very important role for government when it comes to electricity and managing the network, and that cannot be replaced by the private sector. We've seen that over and over again here in Texas, in California. You leave this market to the capitalists, they are going to plunder the consumer. That's just the way it works.
I mean, yeah, nuclear is often sort of pilloried as requiring that government support, but wind and solar are being talked about, as historically cheap. One wonders, why they still require such subsidy. Could you talk a little bit about, the history of the production tax credit? I understand it's, was meant to expire many, many times over. Right. Warren Buffett's famously said, we get a tax credit if we build a lot of wind farms. That's the only reason to build them. They don't make sense without the tax credit. Tell us a little bit more. You've written about this for, I think over a decade.
Yeah.
Fill us in.
Sure.
That particular mechanism.
Yeah, well, sure. So the production tax credit is the federal tax credit that has been given to the wind industry. It's been extended 13 times and expired at the beginning of this year. And is about to, and then if Manchin Schumer passes, then it will be renewed and extended for the 14th time and potentially making it permanent. But it was always viewed as this temporary subsidy in order to get this nascent industry off the ground. And the same with solar. But now we're told over and over again that, wind and solar are cheaper and therefore, they're going to dominate in the market. Well, if they're cheaper, then damn well prove it. You don't need my federal tax dollars to make your business work. And so what we've seen is that this migration or this evolution of these tax credits go from, this was a startup thing, and now it's the favored tax avoidance strategy being used by some of the biggest corporations in America. Mid-American Energy, a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, you mentioned before, Warren Buffett is the CEO of Berkshire. In 2014, he said the only reason to build wind turbines is to get the tax credits. Without them, they don't make any sense. And so you see in Iowa, Mid-American Energy pushing wind and solar and even suing counties like Madison County, Iowa, to force the county to take wind turbines they don't want. So the whole system, the whole way these tax credits have evolved has become totally perverted. And they're fueling what I believe is this big business's assault on rural America. It is an assault in which they're in some cases suing to force these communities to take these projects they don't want because they are being motivated to get yet more and more tax credits. One more point, NextEra Energy, the world's biggest producer of renewable energy, formerly known as Florida Power and Light, has over $4 billion in tax credit carryforwards on their financial statements. This is nearly a $200 billion market cap company. They won't be paying any corporate income taxes for years to come because they have been so effective at subsidy mining and using this cloak of climate change in order to garner all these tax credits to build wind and solar. It's just a truly remarkable story.
Could you get any more cynical, Robert?
I don't think it's even cynicism, Chris. I just think look, I've been a reporter my whole career. I've never had a real job. And I think I'm starting to get where I kind of understand things, right? It's like I'm not an idiot anymore, right? When you start out as a reporter, right, you look back and you think, well, I don't know anything. But now having watched this industry and being more familiar with business, and my first book was on Enron 20 years ago, and understanding how to read financial statements, I'm just trying to be as clear-eyed as I can about this. And what we're seeing is that climatism and corporatism have merged, and it's been incredibly profitable for a very few entities, but that profit is being extracted both from rural communities that don't want these massive projects and from the federal taxpayer as well.
So I saw a great piece. I think you did a guest contribution to Grid Brief actually just just
Oh yeah,
that's Emmett Penny's
our mutual
really
friend
excellent
Emmett Penny,
daily.
who I always get a kick out of. I just think he's a remarkable. I'm going to say kid. That's not diminutive. I don't mean it that way, but I just think that he's doing a remarkable a remarkable job. And he asked me to write that piece, and I thought, well, sure, happy to do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, just everyone who's listening, you got to go and subscribe to that. It's a daily newsletter. Really, if you want to keep your fingers on the pulse of energy, it's a great way to do so. Nice little short tidbits. But you did a piece on Generac, which is a generator, like a home generator company, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe talk about that in the broader context of the state of the U.S. grid right now.
Sure. Well, the piece that I wrote for Grid Brief was called "What's Good for Generac is Bad for America," and I do a fair amount of public speaking, and so I create. I used to not use PowerPoint, and now I use it because I realize talking about numbers and systems, you need visual information to help bring the audience along. So I've used a slide many times, and I just thought, well, hell, I can write 400 or 500 words just on this slide, and that's the message. What's good for Generac is bad for America. Generac is a publicly traded company. They're based in Wisconsin. They provide about 3/4 of all the home standby generators in America, and their business, excuse me, is just booming. Since 2019, their revenues have doubled. Their stock price has quintupled because homeowners all across America are buying home standby generators because they're looking at the grid and experiencing more blackouts. So they're spending $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 to get generators hooked up to their homes. A friend of mine in Houston, she had her system was $12,000 last. I think I spoke to her in January. She said she wasn't expecting to get delivery for a year, and she's spending $12,000. I mean, this is just indicative of how, Texas and where does Generac see their most, their biggest opportunities? Texas and California. Well, hello, yeah, of course.
I mean, I coined this term, the Nigerification of the grid. And that was in reference
Beirutification, where are we going to, we're all going to subscribe to the generator mafia. But but Nigeria is much worse.
Right. But I mean, just this incredible inefficiency in terms of, power generation spending when you have such an unstable grid, where people are voting with their feet to, not quite defect, but certainly to have an insurance policy. And do you have any sense of, what that total spending is? I mean, for that stock price to have gone through the roof, it'd be interesting to know what their sales are and what that would look like if it was actually invested in a more intelligent manner into a actual functional collective grid or, civilizational life support structure.
Well, and I think, and that's the critical point, is that consumers wouldn't be I'm not going to say they're wasting their money. They're investing it in their infrastructure in their home, but they wouldn't be doing that if the grid were as robust and reliable as it should be, right? And looking at Generac's own investor presentations, they're saying we see a very fertile market here for years to come because our penetration rates are so low relative to now, compared to what they could be. But they had just in terms of what are the numbers? This year, they're projecting revenue of over $5 billion, right? Which is double what it was just 3 years ago. So they're doing a land office business. I mean, but I think this is part of what this Nigerification. We're seeing this all around the world, and Europe is going to see some of this. There are blackouts there that people are going to get their own small generators, and they're going to run them on liquid hydrocarbons or natural gas. I think it's going to be more likely it's going to be diesel, gasoline, fuel oil for these smaller gen sets. I've got a 6 kilowatt system, a standby generator. It's not connected to my house, but those kind of generators are going to be, they're proliferating all over the world, but particularly in California, something like 10,000 new permits a year in the Bay Area alone. So this is a booming business because all around the world, grids are faltering because of lack of investment and also because of high cost hydrocarbons.
Do you see an end to this in sight? I mean, one would think you wouldn't have to look further than Europe right now to understand the error of our ways. We've both had Meredith Angwin on several times, the fatal trifecta kind of grid. Maybe define what that is really quickly for our listeners. And I mean, do you see some rationality coming back at some point, or are the kind of path dependencies too great, the patronage relationships too strong?
Well, I'll make one other quick point about hydrocarbon pricing. There was Raymond James is an investment bank here in the U.S. It recently put out a report on the cost of hydrocarbons and pointed out that on a per million BTU basis or per joule basis, that oil is actually now getting close to or even cheaper than natural gas delivered into the European market. So you have gas on the TTF marker, which is the Dutch trading hub. Here in the U.S., we price it at Henry Hub generally, but the TTF hub where it's selling for 6 or 7 times what it is in the U.S., so at $50 or $60 per million BTUs, that's what, $300 or $400 a barrel of oil equivalent. So the point that Raymond James was making was that consumers are going to, some of them are going to switch back to oil to produce power, which is something we haven't seen at scale globally since the 1973 oil embargo.
Right.
After that first oil shock, there was a massive move away from oil for power generation. That time, the U.S. was producing almost 20% of its electricity from oil. Well, then the price shot up, and then we said, well, no, Carter came in, well, let's build more coal plants because we didn't want that oil dependency. But I just wanted to make that quick point. But as far as, what gets this back on track, Chris, I think we're in for a few hard years. I think globally, I'm not an economist, but I'm really paying attention. I'm like you, I'm doing a lot of reporting, talking to people. What do you see? What's happening? These disruptions, partly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, partly because of now Nancy Pelosi's, I think, foolish move to go to Taiwan now. Why are you doing this now? That China is potentially going to, we face potential conflict in around Taiwan. We're just in some really perilous times, and to get the supply chains back in order to either we're going to have to suppress demand through economic slowdown, or we're going to have to, just work out these problems, or we're going to have to work out these problems over years because it took us years to get in the ditch. It's going to take us a long time to get out.
Yeah, on the Taiwan front, we had Angelica Wong on, it must have been a year ago now. And that was in the context of, this losing referendum to, restart, actually just, I think, get started a reactor that's been sitting idle. I think it's never been fueled. But she was talking about, China has no need to invade Taiwan with the dependence on imported fossil fuels and LNG. A simple kind of energy blockade would be enough to sort of bring Taiwan to its knees. It was interesting on that front. But it's funny how energy kind of underlies, obviously, right, so much of geopolitics and so much of what we're facing right now. These high.
But I mean, if they did a blockade's an act of war.
Yeah.
So that you could say just an energy blockade. Well, what else is there? But yeah, any kind of blockade like that is an act of war. And then is the U.S. going to get pulled into that? It's a scary situation.
I thought it would have been a much better play for Putin to not launch a war of aggression, but if he really wanted to put pressure on NATO countries, particularly Europe, simply to do what he's doing now with pipeline politics. I'm not sure that the invasion was necessary in terms of that enormous lever that he held over Europe, and maybe China's learned from some of the difficulty that Russia's had in Ukraine. Who knows? I'm speculating.
Yeah, I don't know, but Russia's hold over Europe is right now it's not. I don't want to overstate it, but it is near total. In that their ability to, we're going to turn the gas on, we're going to turn the gas off. Oh, you want a little more? Okay, well, beg or say nicely or please or whatever it is, and then Putin can make as much money off of diminished flows of hydrocarbons as he was off supplying it in full volume. So, Putin is in a still. I think the thing was it's a disastrous move for him over the long term, but he still has a lot of cards to play. And Nas Al-Haji, a friend of mine, was on the podcast, on the Power Hungry podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was just saying Putin's going to starve Europe as much as he can, and then try and force them to come to some accommodation because it could be a very hard winter for several European countries.
Mm-hmm. Shifting back to renewables, certainly, I think they're as a producer with very low marginal costs. They're also benefiting from high prices. The projects that have been built and are also harvesting subsidies and other forms of kind of rentier capitalism that you've outlined. But in terms of new projects, and the U.S. is going to be embarking on a lot of new projects with these production tax credit subsidies. We've seen skyrocketing prices in terms of some of the basic commodities that are used to build wind and solar. I think that's led to European wind companies now moving to China where they can source labor and commodities much cheaper.
Right.
Polysilicon prices rising by 300% earlier this year. I mean, how do you view that? And I'm interested in the sort of, again, this sort of trade deficit side of this, and the inflation bit of the puzzle, with so much of the supply chain being overseas, the impact on the U.S. economy of further basing its energy future in intermittent renewables.
Well, you make a key point here, I don't know that you said China, but it is all about the Chinese. Well, you did say China, but it is all about Chinese supply chains. And now, just in the last few days, you've seen the Chinese government tell John Kerry, we're not so interested in your climate discussions anymore. Buzz off. I mean, I think they said it somewhat differently in diplomatic language, but that was it, right? That we're suspending any discussions about climate change. This is not our first priority. But when you look at polysilicon, you mentioned, which is the key ingredient in, of course, in solar panels, 70%, something like that, comes from the PRC, and of that, something about half of that comes from the Xinjiang province, where the Chinese government, according to the U.S. government, is committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority and using that same Uyghur Muslim minority as slave labor to produce solar panels. Well, so my question, of course, is, well, how much slave labor can you have in your solar panels and still call it clean energy? I think the answer is zero. Right. But again, none of this is being discussed in the Manchin-Schumer bill. This is like the entirety of the renewable industry doesn't want to talk about this. But it's not just the polysilicon, Chris. Remember, this goes on to neodymium iron boron magnets. So China has a stranglehold, I would say that's the right word, when it comes to the processing of rare earth elements: neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, yttrium, all these other lanthanides on the periodic table are absolutely essential for electric vehicles, for wind turbines. And this is the other part of this entire discussion that's not being, not getting the kind of recognition that it deserves. The Manchin-Schumer bill attempts to make some headway on this, but I think it's going to be incremental in that it's going to take a very long time, and I do mean years or even decades, for the U.S. to ramp up, if it can, mining, processing, and sintering of the mining and refining of the elements that are needed, but also turning them into usable products, including the permanent magnets needed for EVs and wind turbines.
Mm-hmm. What's the state of, I believe there was tariffs or a ban or an attempt to, by the U.S. to respond to the slave labor within the solar supply chain. I've heard some rumblings. I haven't, again, been paying attention as much as I should to what's happening in the U.S., but what's the state of those measures?
Yeah, those tariffs were were put in place last year, if memory serves. And it was because the domestic solar business in the U.S. was looking abroad and saying, well, the Chinese are dumping their solar panels and routing them through other South Asia countries in order to circumvent some of these trade laws. And so there were tariffs were put on solar panels from several countries, including Vietnam and I think Thailand. And then suddenly those, those were all done away with. The Biden administration said, "Oh, never mind. We're okay effectively with China dumping solar panels into the U.S. market." So, all of these things. What worries me most about the Biden administration now, Chris, and I say this as a nonpartisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. Mm-hmm. But I don't see any kind of rationality or any kind of sensibility about what their goals are, right? As a friend of mine said, they have a lot of tactics, but no strategy, and so it's just, you see it in the Manchin-Schumer bill, 69 different line items that give a lollipop to every special interest, every energy-related special interest in the energy business got some little favor in that bill.
I mean, I think the U.S. has a pattern of sort of selective interest in the human rights within certain countries of geopolitical interest, but it certainly is interesting seeing that hand weakened. The Khashoggi murder resulting in some real revulsion internationally, and the U.S. putting some pressure on Saudi Arabia, now begging Saudi Arabia
to... Murder and dismemberment, remember. Murder and dismemberment.
Yeah. Anyway, I think the U.S. is certainly losing its influence and its ability to, leverage human rights issues, again, selectively, but on those countries because of that. Something that, again, Emmett Penny talked about recently, and being, pretty cynical myself, particularly around politics, and seeing a lot of the special interests driving it. And I think the bill illustrates that quite well. But he said, the reason for a current energy mix, that fatal trifecta that Meredith Angwin mentions so eloquently, the over-reliance on renewables, just-in-time natural gas, and dependence on imports. Emmett talked about the patronage relationships responsible for that. And he said, the renewables industry has an excellent patronage relationship with the Democratic Party, the gas industry, good patronage relationship with the Republicans, and wind and solar plus gas also have an excellent patronage relationship amongst themselves. I mean, it seems like something's got to change. There has to be a new special interest that arises. Otherwise, these ones are gonna dominate and really steer policy. And from your own writing, it's become pretty clear what a kind of rentier arrangement we have here. So maybe speak about those special interests, and in terms of the kind of backroom politics, if you see any kind of mechanism for restoring some sanity here.
Yes, I'm hopeful. I am, but I am also very cognizant of the power of these lobbies, and these are some of the biggest corporations, not just in the United States, but in the world, who want to make sure that these tax credits continue to flow, right? And there has been this kind of hand-holding relationship between the renewable business and the gas industry, and the gas industry even marketing itself saying, we're the perfect complement to renewables, right? And so there, how to even discuss it, I think, is the difficult part, because I'm not a Washington insider, but I can read the language in the bill and the CBO report to see, well, how is it that all of this, how is it manifesting itself in the actual line items in the legislation, and the line items that are showing up in the things that the Congressional Budget Office are saying are going to cost taxpayers money. And that's the proof in the pudding, is that these industries, this professional lobby, the as I say, the NGO, corporate, industrial, congressional media complex, incredibly powerful, and they have the ears of policymakers and their policymaker staff, and that they are able to then engineer these pieces. Like, we just want a little taste. We just want a little taste just for us, because it's for the good of the country, and that's always, and it's for the good of the climate. But we just need a little taste, and it's going to be good for everybody, and that's what's happened. But I will say, let me just add this. I'll sound like a homer here, and I know you're a Canadian, but for all of these problems, I still think the U.S. is in an incredibly enviable position vis-a-vis the rest of the world, because, and you talked about currencies, or we mentioned it briefly, look around the world. Which currencies are the strongest now? Well, the dollar and the ruble, which to me are indicative of, well, where are the countries that are producing hydrocarbons, that are producing energy that you can sell? Well, the U.S. and Russia, right? And the pound is now the euro is now nearing parity with the dollar. The British pound is sinking. All of these currencies are falling because they're having to buy energy in dollars, and it's indicating, I think, just where the power is and in the world, and that power comes from those molecules that you can use directly, or you can turn into electrons.
Yeah, getting back to the special interests. One can see the appeal of populist politicians talking about draining the swamp, but again, I just have such a hard time seeing a mechanism for change to occur here.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm optimistic, as Molly Ivan said, optimistic to the point of idiocy. Peter Zion's new book, and I've been working through it. I've listened to him on several podcasts. He's an American geopolitical guy, and he comes to the same point, that his new book is called "The End of the World Is Just the Beginning," and he talks about demographics and all the problems that are facing Europe and China, and but he goes around the world and says, well, compared to the rest of them, the U.S. is in a pretty good position because of favorable demographics, because we don't have any enemies at or near our shores. Although I kind of get worried about you Canadians, you get pretty rowdy, but the U.S. comparatively, due to demographics, et cetera, is still in a pretty good position.
Right, and also being a massive energy powerhouse now.
Right, a massive energy producer. Yeah.
Right. In terms of getting back to the bill once more, and the kind of polarized response to it, the 50-50 vote with the vice president casting the deciding vote, what are Republican objections, and do you feel that they're sensible or grounded in a better understanding of the energy crisis that we're in, or is it just simply opposing the Democrats? And
well, I think it's a lot of the latter, that they don't want to give Biden any kind of a win right now, especially with the midterm elections coming up in November. So they don't want to give the Democrats anything to crow about, right? And so that's certainly part of it. But I think there is also substantive objections to this. And in talking with some people I know in Washington, the parliamentary problems, the way this is being pushed through, I think is just bad for our democratic process. Because when you think about it, we've talked already about the fragility of our electric grid. Well, why hasn't there been a hearing on the effect that these massive subsidies for solar and wind will have on the fragility of the grid? We're already seeing the grid being fragilized because of this push for more wind and solar. We're already seeing the affordability problems due to this influx of wind and solar. But yet there's no discussion of this. And so that to me is just bad policymaking, bad government. And that part of it to me bothers me deeply, because we're supposed to have a process. And instead of a process now, we're getting this jam through thing like, well, you don't like it? Well, sorry, up yours. We're going to make it happen. We don't care what you think. And that's dangerous.
Yeah, I think perhaps the kind of turning point will be more of these blackout events. I mean, you suffered through the Texas blackout. California is getting plagued with, I guess, more mini blackouts there. The MISO or MISO, I forget how it's pronounced, forecasting some real difficulties. And what's interesting is even Gavin Newsom, the pretty famously anti-nuclear governor of California. I think he had an op-ed in the LA Times, basically trying to seed public opinion for the arguments as to why to save Diablo Canyon. And I can't help seeing that as, if this guy's got presidential ambitions, if he leaves California as a total disaster with blackouts, that's not going to, do well for him politically. Right. So, I mean, yeah, I guess talk about maybe some of your own experience going through the blackouts, Texas's response to that. It's much easier to save a nuclear plant to get grid stability or to maintain it, by the threads that it's hanging in California than it is to build new nuclear. But in terms of the Texan response and responses more broadly, what is Texas investing in after the blackout experience? Have they learned their lesson at all?
Well, I'll make one quick comment on Newsom, if you don't mind, on the nuclear part of this. One of the other reasons that I'm optimistic is not only are some American companies like NuScale just got approval from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission here in the U.S. for their design for a light water reactor. So that's a very positive move. Now, whether NuScale will be there, and their design was 50 megawatts electric, I think, or 70 megawatts electric, and their plan is to build multiples as small modular reactors in one place. But they've had a devil of a time getting through the regulatory process, over a decade, and approximately $1 billion. But now it appears that they're through it and that they can move to commercial deployment, which is very positive. So there are some positive noises on nuclear in the U.S. that I think are worth noting, and the U.S. could help lead this worldwide renaissance, I think, in nuclear. But as to Newsom, yes, I mean, I think it's already clear he's throwing his hat in the ring for running for president for 2024, and why wouldn't he? California has the most electoral college votes of any state in the country. He's incredibly handsome. I saw him once in person. I thought, damn, you're beautiful.
He's got good hair.
I mean, I looked at him. I thought, am I gay? I mean, I think you're just like, no, I mean, it was just like, he's like, I mean, he's, movie star handsome, right? And I don't think he has any particular political bent except to, promote Gavin Newsom. But his about face, or his, somewhat tepid support for keeping Diablo Canyon open is telling. But I think it's also practical politics. He's looking at the California grid and seeing how fragile it is, and recognizing, if we unplug the one power plant that's providing roughly 10% of the electricity in a state that already is having, the grid is in meltdown, maybe that's not such a good idea. So, I mean, maybe this is just that some rationality is creeping in despite decades of Democratic anti-nuclear dogma.
Right. And more specifically, again, in regards to Texas,
Right.
what has
Yeah.
been the response to those blackouts in terms of future electricity planning?
Good, thanks. I'm getting on these sidetracks here. You got to keep me focused here, Kiefer.
Well, my questions are always horribly conflated, and I'm always mixing about 5 into them.
No,
So it's not
but
your
Texas is interesting in that I'm from Oklahoma, so I'm not bragging on Texas, and I'm but I've lived here now 37 years, and the grid here is being overwhelmed by weather dependent renewables, and it's pricing out the thermal generators. Now, I will say, despite all the warnings, we haven't had blackouts yet this summer, and we've come close a couple of times, but we're not building dispatchable generation. And and further, the grid has become far too reliant on gas. And because it's reliant on gas and when nat gas prices are going up, prices are going up. And we're seeing that not just in Texas, but of course in California and New York, all across the country, because the gas and electric sectors, the gas and electric grids have merged, but they're still regulated separately. So that point is one of the reasons why merit of this fatal trifecta is so important. This just-in-time delivery of gas is a strategic vulnerability in the system. So, but back to ERCOT in Texas, the managers, the Public Utility Commission, they're doing what they can to try and promulgate new rules that are going to make the grid more stable, incent new investment. But they cannot stop all this federal subsidies, the federal subsidies that are leading developers to only build more wind and solar because that's where the money is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Just briefly, because it's of interest to me, with the Henry Hub price quadrupling in the last 2 years, this price of gas with Ontario, not having a fracking industry and being a major importer now from the U.S. and the impacts it's going to have on our electricity planning. The impacts on replacing a 3.1 gigawatt nuclear complex at Pickering with gas. I'm trying to answer that question. And I know forecasting is notoriously difficult, but where do you see natural gas prices settling in the States over the next decade, say?
Well, now, if I knew the answer to that, Chris, I'd own the Decouple podcast. I'd own your house. I'd own most of your block. I'd own half of Toronto. But I think without being cute, I think what is already clear is that because the U.S. has become a major LNG exporter, that U.S. gas prices are rising toward the global marker, right? And there really isn't a global marker, but there are a couple of markers. One is the TTF trading hub in Holland, which is onshore, but the JKM marker, which Japan, Korea marker for LNG into the Asian market. So the more gas gets exported out of the U.S., the higher the domestic price in the U.S. will be, because there's such an arbitrage play for the shippers to move U.S. gas to other markets. So I think that's one of the macro trends. But then the U.S. then becomes one of the key swing producers in terms of the global price or global availability of gas. So, where will those prices go? I think we'll have higher lows. I think that's clear, that the low price of gas will be higher than it has been in the past. Second, that U.S. drillers are much more disciplined now in their production of gas and oil than they were before, because at the height of the shale revolution, or during the shale revolution, they burned through about $300 billion in cash that just was vaporized. And consumers in the U.S. benefited, and some around the world, because they overproduced and underdelivered on profitability. But now they're not going to do that again. So there's going to be much more discipline in the U.S. in terms of gas production, which I think is the other reason why we will have higher lows in terms of price. But if you're going to ask me to name a price, I can't do that. But I think that we're seeing that is clear trend, and I'm summarize it as that the natural gas molecule, the methane, is becoming much more of an international commodity than it ever was before, and that's because the U.S. U.S. companies have spent so much on LNG export.
I mean, are there a bunch of new LNG terminals getting built? I know there was a fire at one that had interesting impacts on both domestic and international prices. But now that I got you here, I'm kind of eager to to deep dive a bit of this.
Yeah, well, the
topic.
Freeport LNG terminal, there's been a lot of speculation about what happened there and why the plant went offline. But when it did,
was it the Russians?
Again, there's a lot of suspicion around what happened, and I'll just leave it at that. I mean, there's nothing that has been proved or even alleged, except behind closed doors. But you saw when that plant went offline, the price of gas in Europe spiked. Or I'm sorry, the price of gas in the U.S. went down. The price of gas in Europe went up. So this is there are some new LNG terminals that have been approved. I think there was just one the other day. It's hard for me to keep track of them, but yes, the U.S. is now the biggest LNG exporter in the world. And so, who would have thunk it? I mean, when I wrote my third book, Gusher of Lies, it was now 14 years ago. Everyone agreed the U.S. was going to be a major LNG exporter. And in a matter of, less than a decade, exactly flip the script.
Wow. There's a bit of a schizophrenic policy, I think, towards fossil fuels in the U.S. right now.
You think?
Particularly with the Democrats in power. So
this is a steel trap mine for the obvious there, Doctor. Right. It looks like your leg is broken.
Chat about that a little bit because the reason I bring it up is because the Inflation Reduction Act, I think part of what Manchin's cooperation involved was increasing licensing for offshore drilling, I believe. So to what extent is that sort of schizophrenia shifting?
Well, I mean, leave the Inflation Reduction Act to the side. It's this schizophrenia in the Biden administration about berating the oil and gas companies for the profits they're making while at the same time begging them to drill more or telling them they should drill more, or that they, suppressing domestic production. And that's, in fact, what the Biden administration has done by limiting the number of leases that they're going to offer, and then going on bended knee to Riyadh to talk to Mohammed bin Salman or to the Iranians or to the Venezuelans. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, it's like I'm reading it in The Onion. I mean, after decades of all of the, American policy on energy has been around this objection to foreign oil. And now we have the president of the United States going to these foreign countries, including the narco Maduro in Venezuela, which there's no way. PDVSA, the national oil company in Venezuela, they're in shambles. We're going to the Iranians. The Iranians support Hezbollah. Hezbollah was responsible for the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1982, the largest loss of U.S. Marine life, U.S. Marines, since Iwo Jima in World War II. And we're asking the Iranians, what are you doing, man? It just is, schizophrenia doesn't do it proper justice. It just is again, a lot of tactics, but no strategy.
Right. Well, Robert, we're kind of coming towards
Sorry
the end
to
of the
go
interview.
off there, but but it just is true.
No, listen,
but it's truly remarkable about
so much
this kind of
lack
of understanding of what energy security means and how you're going to try and achieve it, and particularly for the low and middle income consumers. High cost energy is the enemy of the poor. It's the enemy of the poor, always, everywhere. And yet here's the Democratic Party, which claims itself to be, or styles itself to be, the party of the working class. And what they're doing is just sticking it to the poor and the middle class. I find it just disgusting, frankly.
Yeah. Are you at liberty to talk about any of your upcoming projects?
Sure. Thanks. I'm working on a new documentary. It's called Burning Down the Grid. I thought I'd made my first and last documentary when I made Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. But after experiencing the blackout here in Texas and seeing what has happened with the grid more broadly in the United States and the future of our generation portfolio, I decided I had to make another documentary. So we're working on it. In fact, our website is live now, burningdownthegrid.com. You can find it there. And then I'm just, grinding away on... actually, I've launched a TikTok channel. Have I mentioned that I'm going to be the king of TikTok now?
No way.
All right. I'm on TikTok. I did a piece on, in fact, just yesterday, I've had 2,000 views already on TikTok. Who knew? About the closure of the New York nuclear plants. So I'm working with my daughter, Mary, who I dearly love. She's in Los Angeles, and she's helping me, get my TikTok game on. So that's been fun because to me, it's just I've done a lot of, I produce a lot of content of different kinds, the podcast and writing and do a lot of speaking. But the idea of being able to produce, here's my argument, and I'm going to do it in about a minute. And that just trying to make that happen is fun. You know, it's a good challenge. It's a new challenge. Why do you care about this? Well, you should care about it because this, and this, 60 seconds, and then see ya.
Yeah, no, I mean, part of me despairs at, how short attention spans are and, the ways in which it's hard to develop complex arguments. But at the same time, I mean, with Twitter and TikTok, it forces you to be brief, to get to the point. And it's almost like
to meet the audience, you have to meet the audience where
and there's a certain beauty to that.
Meet the audience where they are. And, I just turned 62 last month. And so TikTok represents a whole other demographic that I might not otherwise, you look at your statistics on who your audience is, and mine skews toward people who are, look kind of like me, and they live in the United States. And so if I can reach, beyond that, even just as a lark, well, why wouldn't I, to try and do something else to, I don't want to sound too pompous here, but broaden the reach, to try and reach a new audience, to try and force myself, because it is hard to do something in a different medium that allows me the possibility of expanding the conversation or affecting a few opinions. I think that's exciting.
Yeah, no, I long ago gave up on trying to keep up with your pace of content creation, but I got to say it's really admirable. This is clearly a passion project for you. Up to 1:30 in the morning last night, going over some of the paperwork related to the bill, and just banging out the podcast, and now TikTok.
Like, what is, it's just like, I nerd out on this stuff, but it's because it's so important. And I think it's the same motivation that you have, that these are the most important issues in our society. And we are called, our purpose is to make sure that we're doing what we can to put the light on them, because they are so important.
Right. Well, given all your time constraints, appreciate you making time for Decouple today.
Always happy to do it, Chris. Thanks.